When it comes to freedom in an oppressive, authoritarian regime, resistance has a price. It comes with the price of courage, the price of dedication, and the price of your choices that you make to stay in resistance until there is freedom for everyone. And today we'll be hearing from a freedom fighter for Iranian human rights, Zolal Habibi, who has over 25 years of dedicated advocacy. And we're going to hear all about her journey of empowerment and courage and resistance. Join us to find out more.
Soul Nectar Show, the Soul Nectar Show. You're invited, delighted to discover who you are. Anything is possible if you believe. So join us on this beautiful journey. Soul Nectar Show, Soul Nectar Show.
Well, hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Soul Nectar Show, that show where we talk about all things essence, where we gather around the campfire and we share our stories of connection to that which is greater than us, to the big mystery beyond the veil, to those synchronistic moments that lead us inexorably to a different understanding about what we are doing here on this planet Earth. Earth School, as I call it. I'm your host, Kerri Hummingbird. And we have been doing these broadcasts every week for about over 10 years now. And we've had some really amazing conversations. And we're going to lean a little bit today into empowerment conversation and women's rights and advocacy and what does resistance look like. And, you know, we're facing what I would call the end of the patriarchy on the planet right now, and also the end of the power over matrix, where people derive their power, their sense of being powerful, by having power over other people. And we're moving into a time on the planet where we're going to be having power within is the primary model. So it's your own power within, not the power that you can get by having power over someone else, but the power that you can have within yourself and that you can recognize within yourself, and that everybody has that same power. And so it's going to be quite a different world that we're stepping into, yet we are still stepping out of the old world. And so as we're making this transition, it seems like it's just quite dark at times. And if you're looking out into the world, we can see some very hopeful things, some very beautiful things, some very encouraging things, and that are really bringing in the new paradigm. We can also see some examples of exactly why we're moving into a new paradigm. And we can see the examples of control and domination and subjugation and oppression. And, so when these paradigms of the power over model are kind of rearing their last ugly heads, how do we want to be an advocacy of sovereignty and empowerment and women's rights and the rights of just about any group that's being oppressed? And, we have that example of oppression happening, in the United States, so certainly happening all over the United States, that kind of oppressive, aggressive, authoritarian sort of behavior. And we also see it in other parts of the world as well. And so today I have just the honor and privilege of having a beautiful Iranian human rights activist with over 25 years of dedicated advocacy on behalf of political prisoners, women, and freedom seekers inside Iran. And Zolal Habibi is with us. Welcome, Zolal.
Thank you, Kerri. It's a pleasure to be with you, and please allow me to greet all those who are tuning in to the podcast today. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, it's just delightful to have you here, and know that I'm really quite impressed with your life of activism and your focus on, even from your teens, and a pivotal moment that I'm sure you'll tell us about, where you lost your father, who was a respected Iranian writer and political dissident that was killed during the 1988 massacre. And you, instead of, we always have two paths when tragedies happen. We can curl up inside, and be helpless and kind of live very discouraged and fearful. Or we can do what you did, which is turn that tragedy into purpose. And so since then, you've worked to amplify the voices of Iranian resistance on international platforms and human rights forums and global media. And so you are an Iranian American, and so you do bridge cultural understanding, but you also are here to advocate for a free and democratic Iran. And so I just want to welcome you to the show and welcome your voice and your perspectives. And yeah, I'm just excited for people to hear what you have to say. You have so much to say. When we talked initially about women uplifting other women and how do you create effective resistance, and and so I just would like to have you start, I guess, with what was the decision inside of you when your father, who I'm sure you absolutely beloved, your father, what was your decision making process like in the wake of his death?
Well, to go back, you're exactly right. I think for any child, losing a parent is devastating, but literally I was daddy's little girl, just like the equivalent of that phrase. And especially because my dad was a writer, and he was at home more with us. And so and he, because of his background in psychology and sociology and everything, so he had like this very close connection, I guess. And this is something that I learned later on, that this is something that he did with, kids in the family, like my cousins and everyone else. They tell me these stories now that, even when he was a teenager and they were kids, he had this kind of a, connection with them too. But because of that, I was very attached to my dad, and losing him was a major blow, especially since I was only 7 at the time. I don't think I probably didn't make a decision to continue the path at that age, but I remember my outlook at that age. I think one of the things that helped me cope with the situation that we came face to face with was having had already the experience of learning about the situation in Iran and what was happening in the tragedies from my parents. I think I was like about 4 or 5 the first time I had met people who were victims of torture, or I knew so many around me who had lost their loved ones, be it friends who had lost, some of them, both their parents or a parent, or even friends who at the age of 4 or 5 they had already experienced the prisons of Iran. So having that knowledge of knowing that this is what's happening on day-to-day basis in Iran, it made you realize that, okay, you're not like an exception to the rule, and it's not something that you're not the only victim here. And I think I ended up seeing, I guess, the cup half full instead of the empty part of it. And that really helped in not seeing myself as a victim, but actually as someone who has had immense possibilities and situations that maybe a lot of people aren't given in life, and to be grateful for what I do have, or the time that I did have with my dad. Because like whenever I looked at my brother, I would say, well, he's only 3. To this day, my brother has no recollections of my parents, and so for me, I'm grateful for having had that. But I think at that time when my father passed, I found out about like 2 months later. At first, my mom was trying to hide it from me as much as she could, but I actually ran into a newspaper that had ran a tribute to my father. And I ran into this page, and I saw like this page with 3 pictures of my dad and a poem dedicated to my dad. And the dedication said, dedicated to Zolal and Masi, as they say farewell to their father as he goes on his eternal trip or something like that. And so I remember thinking, since when do they write, poems whenever my dad goes on a trip? My dad always goes on, trips for his work. And so that's how I found out. And my mom, like, she walked in and she saw this and she was just like devastated. And then she explained to me what had happened. But the reality is that that summer, 30,000 political prisoners were executed in Iran. Many people that I had known personally had also been killed by the regime that summer. So that just, I guess, put things into a different perspective when you know that you're not, this isn't something that just happened to you. This is something that has happened to a country right now. And a nation. And I remember even at that age, there was a story, like a bedtime story my parents used to tell us. And that was my most, I guess, favorite bedtime story. It was The City Without Smiles. It was about a city that there was a tyrant and the tyrant didn't have a smile. So what did he do? He would try to take away people's smiles and see if it fits his lips, and everyone's smile is unique to them. So it's not going to be a match. So he was taking away the city's smiles. But the people revolted against him and took him out. And so that was like the story. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I'm not going to give that satisfaction to Khomeini. I'm not going to allow him to take away my smile and to, for me to just, as you said, just go into my, I guess, somber mode and just be like, giving into these sorrows. In fact, I'm going to change. I'm not going to give them that satisfaction, and I'm going to continue. I'm going to hold my head up high and be proud of, my dad and the fact that he gave his life for the freedom of Iran. And at 7, I understood that. And I think that was really important, having that understanding. Fast forward, my turning point in deciding to join the resistance was after I graduated from high school, actually. So I was on the path of, education was a big issue. I don't know how many Iranians you are in contact with, but education is a big deal in our culture. Iranians, they always say jokingly, but if you're not a doctor, engineer, or lawyer, it doesn't count. So it has to be something at that level or higher. So I was actually on my way to study medicine. Growing up, we were always taught, you guys have to, there was like this, I guess, division, like it was our parents' generation's responsibility to free Iran, and it would be our responsibility to rebuild Iran. So you had to become something that would be able to serve your people, right? And so I was going to pursue medicine. I had gotten a full scholarship, and that was like the roadmap ahead. But then summer of 1999, student uprisings broke out in Iran in July. And it was the first time since the 80s that a major uprising was taking place in Iran. And it was the first time that it was actually being broadcast to the world live, because it was the start of cable television and cable news and CNN and whatnot. And I remember watching those scenes and thinking to myself, what are you doing? Are you just going to be like a bystander and just watch that, people from your generation, they're all people who were born after the 1979 revolution, who are in the streets right now, are just going to watch and see them be killed at point blank for the freedom of Iran, and you're just going to be watching from, the US, and then once the regime is overthrown, you're just going to go there with a plane, or are you going to do something about it? And so that was like the turning point for me. I remember thinking about an article that I had seen like a year before it. It was the summer of '98, I think. I was looking at a magazine, and there was an article that said there are 20,000 Iranian doctors at that time in the US. Right now, I think it's like about 100,000. But, I thought, are you going to be one of those 20,000? Or are you going to do something for those 20,000 to actually be able to go and serve their own people? And so that is when I decided to join the resistance. Because of our family experience, I knew that this is going to be a uphill battle. I knew that it wasn't going to be easy. I knew that it wasn't going to be, it is the path less followed because of the price, and the sacrifice that you have to make, the day-to-day decision, because as they say, it's always easier to die for a cause than to live for a cause and to dedicate, decades of your life to a cause. I remember like one of the first things that I thought to myself when I made that decision, I was like, are you going to be in it for the long haul and not just right now in the moment, in this, the spare of the moment. And I remember making that decision that yes, I am in it no matter how long it takes. Because I think that at the end of the day, this is the greatest accomplishment I could ever dream of in my life. If we're able to give or return sovereignty to the people of Iran, freedom to the people of Iran, for the people of Iran to be able to see an actual democracy after like over a century, that is worth it, because it's a cause much, higher than what we could even imagine in our personal lives, and it's something that can change the path of history. And so for me, that is more than I could ever wish for.
I love that you gave us that entire sequence of how you decided to be part of the resistance, because I feel like so many of us are facing that question right now as to like, how do we serve in the middle of, the world being the way it is, many countries facing sort of oppression, from police forces, or the United States, it's, immigration roundup, and just there's just been a lot of let's just say less diplomacy and more force, and so when we're talking about creating a new kind of world where everyone has the freedom to be who they are, which I think is what many of us want, most people would like to have a situation where people are free to express themselves and free to live their own truth. But when you're in an oppressive environment, then how do you get the courage to do that? How did you find the courage within yourself to commit to the resistance?
I think the most important aspect is your outlook on the situation, and like the perspective that you have. I think that there are times that you see a problem and you're like, well, someone needs to do something about this, or like they need to change the system. Or you look at it and you're like, what am I going to do to change this situation? What is my responsibility here? So keeping the concentration on yourself and your role. And I think that is like the most important aspect, because I think that in terms of strengths and weaknesses, the difference between people is very, very limited. Maybe it's like 1%. It's really not that great of a deal. This person has these characteristics, that person has those characters. It doesn't really make a difference at the end of the day. What does make a difference is, are you willing to make that decision and pay the price for your decisions? It might be like baby steps. It might be like larger steps. It might be leaps. But at the end of the day, what is decisive is, are you going to look at the situation and say, what is my responsibility? Or are you looking at others and just waiting, having expectations from others? Or do you see yourself as that agent of change? I think that is like the key point. And that is something that I've learned from Mrs. Rajabi, actually. She is the president-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. And but to me, she's my like greatest role model in life and has been since I was like in my teens. And she has always taught that look, and in whatever the circumstances, what is your responsibility? And never think that, oh, there are, people higher up that have like this responsibility. Like, it doesn't make a difference who you are, where you are, how old you are, what is your background. You could take on that responsibility. And I think that is something that's really important. And when you look in the history of our movement, that is like a key factor. I'd like to go back to the fact that how this organization was even founded. It was founded by 3 students in 1965. And these 3 students decided to take it on themselves to put together an organization to overthrow the Shah and they didn't think that, there would be a dictator after that too, but the fact that 60 years right now, it's been 60 years since this organization was formed, and it has been fighting against 2 dictatorships without 1 hour of break in between. And that in itself, whenever I put myself in their shoes, I'm like, how did they dare to take on that responsibility as like 3 students, right? Who were, all 3 of them, unfortunately, were executed during the Shah's time. So just a few years later, in their early 30s, like 31, 32 years old, when they were executed. But then you also see that continuing till today. Just unfortunately, about 2 months ago, a group of 6 were executed in Iran. And they have, their impact that these 6 have made on Iran society has been immense. This is something that people are comparing to the founders of this movement. People are comparing to some of those people who became like the ideals in the 1979 revolution, who had been killed during the Shah's time, with their testimonials and whatever. And they just, they were the ones who woke up society that, look, we need to create that change. And they are at the same age too. They're 31, 32, and 33 when they were executed, like 3 of the 6. And so I see like that connection, and that is something that is really inspiring, to see, generation after generation being created of people who see that responsibility and that having that, I guess, agency, and taking it upon themselves to be the change they want to see. I think, I don't know if you were like this, I was like this, but like in high school when we were studying like history, and we would study like World War II era, or the civil rights movement in the US or whatnot, I always thought like, why didn't people do something about it, back then? Or like, how did they allow it to go to such extents, or what? Or just think about like, where would you be standing if you were alive back then, and what would you have done? And I was, reassured, I guess, with the path that I chosen. I thought, okay, even if I was then, I would have probably been on this side of history, and I would have taken action on it, because that is what I decided to do. But I think that for me, I think the most important thing was, first of all, I had great role models, as I said, and I knew that it was a paved road ahead of me already. There are people who had paid the price, and they had, taught us the ropes, and they, took our hands in and took us in. I had the role models like as my parents, my dad, who, I think he taught us what was important in life, not through his words and his writing, but through his own actions. And he acted on the things that he actually wrote about. And then on the other hand, I had my mom who, at the age of 25, she decided to join this movement. And, whenever I think of that decision that she made, to leave a comfortable life in the US, and at that time go to Iraq, to border area of Iran and Iraq, with 2 small children, that is just defying all, odds. And but society expects from her. Everyone expected from her to, now that your husband has died, you need to, concentrate and take care of your kids. Or no, she decided to choose another path. And I am forever grateful that she did choose that path. And I learn from her every single day. And she has been, part of this fight now for like 38 years, dedicating 38 years of your life to a cause that is something that's truly very valuable.
Yeah, I love that what you were sharing with me about the effect of women lifting up other women to have courage to speak, to stay the course, to be in this energy of resistance. And what I find interesting is that when women come together with a common purpose, with that is really with an intent of elevating everyone, what happens is beautiful. What happens is kind of like matriarchy, right? Where everybody is wanted, every voice is appreciated, every woman is lifted. And I think that's where we're going. I know that's where we're going. And we're like kind of in this last gasps of the old model, as it nails on a chalkboard tries to stay in place. And I think many of us are waking up to see it who haven't seen it in its fullness. But when you actually consider that in a woman's mother's body, the perspective is very different, because when there are children killed, for example, those could be our children. Those could be my children. When I see that happening, when I see what happened, with the bombings, and I see just so many countries where this is happening, those could be my children that were caught up in that. And the only reason they're not is because of geography and just chance, right? So I think we have a different perspective when we have a body that births life. We have a very different perspective than a masculine body. And I'm not saying that there aren't lots of great conscious males out there who are great fathers, who are very protective of their families and their children. But what I'm saying is that like the perspective is just really, really different when you actually give life. You have a different appreciation for it, I think.
I think that like what we see, we do think that women are the force for change, especially in Iran. But we think that this is the path to the emancipation of human beings. If you want to see true equality, you have to understand that patriarchy, it hasn't only enchained women, but it's also a shackle on the men too. So the path to the liberation of human beings goes through women's empowerment and creating that equity that is needed to be able to reach equality. Because patriarchy, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, historically, it's like thousands of years, right? So it's going to take a very long process to be able to push it completely out, because we are born, we're not born with it, but we are raised with this, mentality from childhood. So to be able to reverse that, it's going to take probably a few generations in the process, but it's a needed decision, and it is something that you have to make that choice and then start mentally making that decision, with open eyes, and then choosing the opposite path of what you are taught as, and it becomes your second nature, to push that aside. And I think that is something that we have done and it's I am very proud to say that it's been 41 years that this movement has had women's empowerment and has really concentrated on women's empowerment as one of the major, I guess, milestones in the fight with a misogynist regime like the Mughals. And in this process, I mean, since 1989, all the Secretary Generals of the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran have been women. The entire leadership council of this movement are women. 52% of the National Council of Resistance of Iran are women. And our president-elect is a woman. And I think what is very important about Ms. Rajavi is the fact that, first of all, she joined this movement as a 19-year-old student. But in the last 41 years, she has co-led this movement, so that the burden of overthrowing this regime has been on her shoulders for 41 years. And that kind of dedication is something that's, I think, unprecedented. That day in, day out, every single waking moment is just concentrated on this issue. But what she has done in the process is she wasn't after becoming like that superstar herself, you know. What she did was from the first moment she started taking the hands of other women and was like, no, should be systematic. This isn't about one person having these characteristics or having these strengths. It's systematic. It's every human being, every single woman has this potential, and we need to be able to, you know, extend that. And the path is by always giving or sacrificing for others and putting everyone else before yourself. And this is going to be, you know, this is that cycle that's going to free up energy. And she believes in, you know, she always says that I believe in E equals MC2, and that energy can only be extracted once you are free from these, you know, egotistical views that we have in each one of us, and these, you know, gender, I guess, gender roles that are created in our minds from the offset. And so I think that in this process, she has truly been able to give people that space to be able to break those barriers and to free up their energy. And that is why this movement has been able to accomplish things that are unprecedented in history, and continue the fight. Because literally, I mean, these days, you were just mentioning about the war. I think everyone these days, they're seeing, you know, the true colors of the Iranian regime and how complex it is. No one thought that it would be able to endure like a war with the US and whatnot. It has, but this regime is more complex than many had, you know, had in their minds. But what is the one movement that this regime fears the most? And it says it clearly. The regime says that we're not going to fall with a foreign war. We're not going to fall, we're not threatened by this. They say the one thing that we fear the most is the Iranian resistance. And because they have withstood this fight for 40 something years now against the mullahs, and the regime has done everything in their power to destroy this movement. But we have always risen from the ashes, and we have never given it. And I think that that is exactly what the world needs to like recognize and see. And that's why I think that there are those who they understand that this movement has the strength, and that is why we are not their first choice for opposition or for the alternative to this regime, because they know that we will never allow our people to be, you know, misused, or we're not going to serve their interests. We will be serving the interests of the Iranian people. And I think that is something that, especially considering Iran's geopolitical role throughout history, and especially right now in the region, that is something that comes into play. Because if you look, like for instance, when Dr. Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil, you saw its ripple effect throughout the Middle East. Movements started creating, like in other Middle Eastern countries, like, yeah, we need to be independent ourselves too. And, a whole movement against imperialism and whatnot started forming, which was a threat to Western powers. And that's why they had the coup d'etat against Dr. Mossadegh. But then we also see the negative aspect of it too. Like in 1979, when Khomeini came into power, you also saw the ripple effect with the spread of Islamic fundamentalism in the region. And interestingly, the first movement that touched on Islamic fundamentalism as the new global threat was Mrs. Rajavi in 1995. In 1995, she had a speech in Norway, and there she discussed this, and she said, look, the new global threat is Islamic fundamentalism if you don't take it seriously. And no one understood it then, or no one comprehended it then, until after 9/11. And then they're like, oh, you guys had a book about that like a few years ago. And we're like, yeah, about a decade ago. But, no one
Nobody was listening.
But, yeah, but
people didn't really believe it was possible, I think. And
yeah.
Yeah.
And also in regards to Iran's nuclear program, who was the first to reveal Iran's nuclear program? It was the National Council of Resistance of Iran in summer of 2002. But unfortunately, the world like dragged its feet instead of reacting to that information. And then they started negotiating with this regime, but they used the source of the information as the bargaining chip in the negotiation. So of course you're going in the wrong direction. But unfortunately, the people of Iran have paid that price bravely. And it has meant the lives of thousands. I mean, we just saw in January, I think the world saw that, thousands of people who were killed in the streets of Iran for demanding basic freedoms. 120,000 people have been executed since 1981 till now, just for supporting this movement. And it continues. I mean, yes, actually today, we had a message from one of the political prisoners who's on death row. And reading it, I got goosebumps. This guy, he was 19 when he was arrested. He is a boxing champion, and he is on death row. He has his execution sentence has been actually confirmed 3 times. And still, despite that, he has given this very strong message, and he wrote in it that my last message that I gave was not aired because due to his own security and safety, the movement did not air it. And he said, I'm requesting for you to air it. I understand the costs. I understand that this will irritate the regime. They might act on it or whatnot, but I want that message to be sent to the people of Iran. And just imagine what that does for the people inside of Iran. When they see people who are in shackles, in the prisons of Iran, under death row, but they are still defiant. They're still standing. They are still saying that we will overthrow you. And we are the last generation that's going to be executed in Iran. And because we are going to put an end to your rule, and we are going to be the last nail on your coffin. And I think that kind of bravery, it has its effect on society, and people learn from it. And that's why you see the bravery on the streets of Iran today.
It's so powerful. Really beautiful. Yeah, and as I look at the situation as you've described it, and I just compare it to what I'm seeing in the United States, I think the really dangerous thing is people being conditioned with a mindset of obeying authority, like authority figures, and not thinking for themselves, like not being taught how to think for themselves, not being taught how to embrace other perspectives, not being exposed to people that don't look like them or believe like them or talk like them, or and just kind of siloing in a perspective, because then it's just, I mean, I found it, and I'm sure the situation is the same in Iran, where like I'm sure there are women-bodied people who support the regime, right? And so it kind of blows your mind when people would go against their own best interests or their own best interests of their children to support something that's destructive. But it happens. It's just part of human psychology. And so as you're out there educating and encouraging people to be, empowered, right? To think for yourself, to have courage in yourself, to learn other perspectives, to educate yourself, that these are all really important things for creating, and then having people that they admire, right, also stand up and say, this is what is right. I think it's so powerful, the grassroots nature of it, and how many people are, giving themselves to the movement and speaking up and sharing. And I know in the United States people are doing that as well, but it's very hard sometimes speaking to people who are locked in that authoritarian mindset. Like they have a very rigid way of thinking about things, very narrow focused and very small. Yeah, and they get threatened by things that are out of their control, right? And they get scared by being punished too, right? It's scared of being punished. So you have to have some kind of bigger self or a bigger knowing of yourself outside of this lifetime in order to take chances like that, in order to say, I am part of a movement. My life is significant in the movement, and I'm significant beyond this life, and I'm going to do what I need to do with my life force, regardless of the outcome, to my physicality, is what I keep hearing you say over and over. And so I think I hope I didn't misspeak for you, but I feel like I wanted to just kind of sum up what I heard. And for anybody who's listening, who's confronting a similar issue, whether not as dramatic as Iran maybe, but in some smaller way, like what you're experiencing, I hope you found some faith and some insight and inspiration from this interview. Is there anything else you want to share before we wrap up the interview?
I just wanted to add something to what you just said. I think that we should always take into consideration that it's very difficult to swim against the current. So in society in general, people just go with the flow, right? And also understand that it's always a very, very small percentage, and I think it's less than 1% of society that actually creates change in society. So, you shouldn't have expectations that everyone is going to, revolt and stand for what's right and just and whatnot. When it happens, they'll be like, oh, I stood with that, I supported that, but it's not going to be that way. So if you understand that and you're not disillusioned by it, you don't expect, like, for instance, a lot of people always, like, when it comes to Iran, this is a constant discussion among Iranians. They're like, why is it that when there's like a major uprising in Iran, you see, like, even in the diaspora, you see like a whole bunch of people coming to the scene and everyone is active and everything, and after 3 months later, it's withers away. Well, that is the difference. That is sometimes when people think in a short time, or they might reach something, they're willing to, come in, pay that price. But when it becomes longer term, not everyone is going to stick with that. No, not everyone is willing to pay that price. I remember I was 16 once, and I had gotten to a demonstration, and I started, it was against these chain murders that the regime was doing of political prisoners back then in the 90s. And I remember I started like chanting in the demonstration, like, down with Khamenei, down with, the regime. And there was a man who was walking in, they're like, no, we're not supposed to chant. And I was like, then why are we in a protest? Because if people don't know why we're doing this. And it was a Saturday night in Georgetown, and I was like in DC. And so I was like, if we're not going to chant, no one's going to know why we're doing this. And he said, well, things that we don't all agree. I was like, okay, we are all here because of the chain murders. We all know that it was carried out by the regime. The head of this regime is Khamenei. So what's the question here? And then he was like, you are very brave that you do this. And I was like, okay. And so I continued. And then a woman came up to me and she said, excuse me, but we want to go to Iran this summer, and you're ruining that. And I was like, well, you're not willing to pay that much of a price? for the freedom of the people of Iran, to stop going to Iran, to stop allowing this regime to normalize the crimes that it's perpetrating. So I came face to face with that reality when I was 16. So I started finding out. I was like, okay, there are a lot of people who say they want to see a free Iran. They're not willing to pay a price for that free Iran. And then they start attacking you who wants to pay that price and try to, because then, they have to answer their own conscience. Okay, she's willing to pay that price. I'm not willing to pay that price. They have to justify it somehow in their minds. And so I think that it's very important to understand that and not to be, dismayed by it. Always, and that's why I said at the beginning of our conversation, never to have expectations from others. Instead, think, what is my responsibility and what can I do? And know that you can make a difference. No matter where you are, no matter what the issue, you can make the difference if you put your mind to it, if you make that decision and you pay the price for that decision. So no matter how big the issue or how small, each one of us can be that agent of change only when we are not we don't have expectations from others, but we take it upon ourselves to be that change that we want to see. And I think that if we each do our own part that way, we will very soon see major changes in our society or in the cause that we are fighting for. And I think that is what we're seeing also in Iran. Like the Gen Z of Iran, those who took to the streets in January, for instance, a lot of them, when you speak to them, they're like, you know what? We look at our parents' generation and our grandparents. Our grandparents' generation were the generation who created the revolution, but then it was stolen from them. And then they saw all the executions in the 1980s and the war, 8-year war with Iraq, and they saw all those devastation. So when it came to their children, they just wanted to safeguard their children. They didn't think of the big picture. They just thought of that child, right? And because of that, they wouldn't allow their children to be active, politically active, or do anything. And so now their grandchildren are like, well, you know what? Our parents, they've lived their life, but was that really life that they're living? Or they're just, I guess, just passing of time. We don't want that. We rather pay the price, but at least the next generation to see freedom, or others in our generation to see the freedom. And we're not going to give in the way our parents were raised. And that is why you see that defiance and that you see that ambition. And everyone kept on saying that in January, you could see hope in people's eyes. And that's what was different. And that's why you saw them on the offensive. You saw them disarming the suppressive forces. Because they understood, look, no one's going to hand us freedom in a silver platter. We have to pay the price ourselves. So are we going to do it or not? And I think that is that agent of change. And that is what we're seeing today. And I think it's also a great deal of it is because of the role of resistance units throughout Iran who are keeping that flame of resistance alive. They're paying the price with their lives. There have been over 40 political prisoners and protesters executed in just the last 2 months in Iran since the ceasefire. But they're still resilient and they're still continuing and they're still not giving in. And they are setting a precedent for people in their own generation that, look, this is the path that we have to go to be able to reach a free Iran. And hopefully we'll be able to see that soon. I'd also like to just add one more thing. I don't know when this is going to be aired, but on June 20th, there is going to be a huge rally in Paris to draw attention to the new wave of executions in Iran because the regime is calling for the repetition of the 1988 massacre to be able to keep themselves afloat. There are a lot of parallels. The 1988 massacre started the day of the ceasefire during the Iran-Iraq war. This new wave of execution started the day of the ceasefire of this war. So we are trying to draw attention to this, and we're calling on everyone to join. So if you happen to be in Paris, you could join, but it will also be broadcast live on social media. So just voice your support, stand by the people of Iran, raise awareness, and tell everyone that the people of Iran, they have the potential to bring about change. Their message is that we're not stuck between, there aren't only two options on the ground, either war or appeasement. No, there's a third option, and that's supporting the people of Iran to create change. And we're not stuck in choosing between the current theocracy and the previous dictatorship, which was a monarchy. There's a third option there too. We want to create a secular democratic republic. Secular meaning it's not a theocracy, democratic meaning it's not a dictatorship, and a republic, which means it's not a monarchy. So hopefully we will be able to see the dawn of freedom soon. And as you said, though, it's always darkest before dawn, right? So we can't be dismayed by the situation that we see. We have to understand that it's not going to be easy, but if you pay the price and you stay consistent, you'll be able to bring about that change.
Beautiful. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your heart and your lived experience with us. So grateful for everything that you shared, Zolal. Thank you for being with us.
It was a pleasure to be with you.
I'm going to share links to all the the Council of Resistance of Iran and many other links that Zolal has given me. And so that will be in the show notes. So you can look down in the show notes to see that. And in the meantime, I'm just I always end the show with kisses and blessings for everybody. So however you want to join with blessing everybody who's listened, I'm going to just do that now. Please like, share, and subscribe, everybody, and share this interview out with anybody that you think would be open to hearing it, and also just share it on your channel wherever you want and get the message out. Okay, here we go. Here come kisses. Love you guys.
Thank you.
We'll see you guys next time on Soul Nectar Show. Bye for now.
Goodbye.
If you found even one gold nugget in this episode of Soul Nectar Show, will you do us a favor? Will you subscribe, like, and share this episode? Maybe even write a comment and let us know what you thought about it. We really, really want to engage with you at a much deeper level. Let's be part of community together. Have a great week, everyone. Bye for now.
Soul Nectar Show. Awaken, awake, show. Take a sip from the drip of nectar, from the source of who you are.